Right now, at this very moment, American fighter jets are conducting strikes deep inside Iran. Oil tankers are rerouting away from the Persian Gulf. Congress is hours away from a constitutional showdown. Stock markets opened this Monday morning in a state of controlled panic, and for the first time in decades, the United States is simultaneously managing an active shooting war, a fracturing alliance with Europe, a cold calculation from China, and a delicate diplomatic dance with Russia all at once. 4 American service members are confirmed dead. The supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, is gone, killed in a joint U.S. and Israeli military operation that launched in the early hours of Saturday, March 1st. The world woke up this weekend to a Middle East that looks nothing like it did 7 days ago. This is not a drill. This is not a simulation. This is the most consequential 72 hours in American foreign policy since the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and the economic, geopolitical, and constitutional consequences are already being felt from Washington to Beijing, from Brussels to Moscow. Stay with me, because in the next 20 minutes I am going to break down every dimension of what is happening right now. The war, the politics, the economics, and what it all means for the United States and the world. Let's begin. In the early hours of Saturday, February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated military campaign against the Islamic Republic of Iran. The operation, which President Donald Trump labeled Operation Epic Fury, began with waves of airstrikes targeting military installations, nuclear-related facilities, and command structures across the country. According to CNBC and NPR reporting, the strikes were described by the Trump administration as massive and, in the president's own words, ongoing. The single most consequential outcome of those opening hours, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader of more than 3 decades, was killed. Iranian state television confirmed his death on Saturday, and by Sunday, the Iranian government announced 40 days of national mourning. This was not a peripheral development. Khamenei was the undisputed center of gravity of the Iranian political system. His death has triggered an immediate succession crisis in Tehran, with reports indicating that acting Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Reza Rafi may have also been struck in subsequent waves of attack, though this has not been independently verified. Iran's response has been swift and wide-ranging. According to Al Jazeera's live tracker, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps claimed to have launched retaliatory attacks against 27 U.S. military bases across the Middle East, as well as Israeli military infrastructure in Tel Aviv and other cities. Iranian drones and ballistic missiles struck targets in Bahrain, including the headquarters of the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet in the Jubair area, as well as Saudi Arabia's capital Riyadh, the UAE, Kuwait, and Jordan. The Jordanian armed forces reported intercepting 49 drones and ballistic missiles alone. In the UAE, at least 3 people were confirmed killed and 58 wounded. For the United States, the first casualties of the operation became public on Sunday. The Pentagon confirmed that 3 American service members were killed and at least 5 were seriously wounded by Iranian attacks in Kuwait. By Monday, March 2nd, that number had risen to 4 confirmed dead. President Trump, speaking at a Medal of Honor ceremony at the White House, acknowledged the losses directly. And sadly, there will likely be more before it ends. That's the way it is, Trump said in a video posted to Truth Social earlier Sunday. He called the fallen soldiers true American patriots who have made the ultimate sacrifice. Trump also publicly outlined the timeline for the operation on Monday. He stated that the U.S. had expected from the beginning that the military campaign would last 4 to 5 weeks, but noted that operations were already substantially ahead of time projections. The president assured reporters that U.S. forces have the strongest and most powerful military in the world and would easily prevail. While missiles fly over the Persian Gulf, a political battle of historic proportions is taking shape on the floor of the United States Congress. And it is a battle that strikes at the very heart of American democracy. Who has the constitutional power to take the country to war? The U.S. Constitution is unambiguous. The power to declare war belongs to Congress, not the president. Yet President Trump launched Operation Epic Fury without a congressional vote, without congressional authorization, and according to Democrats and several Republicans, without adequate briefing of lawmakers before the strikes began. Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia, the lead sponsor of the Senate's War Powers Resolution, was direct about his assessment on Fox News Sunday. "This is an illegal war," Kane said. "The Constitution says no declaration of war without Congress. The president has called this war against Iran." As of Monday, March 2nd, both the House and the Senate are gearing up for votes on war powers resolutions that would require Trump to seek congressional approval before continuing military operations. House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries of New York stated that the administration must seek authorization for the preemptive use of military force that constitutes an act of war. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer demanded that Congress be briefed immediately and made his opposition clear: the American people do not want another endless and costly war in the Middle East. However, legal and political analysts are tempering expectations about what such a resolution can actually accomplish. According to Dan Ehrman, Director of Law and Public Policy at Northeastern University, the War Powers Resolution has never been successfully tested in court on its merits. Even if a resolution passes in both chambers, which is far from guaranteed, given that Republicans hold narrow majorities, President Trump would almost certainly veto it. And Congress does not have the two-thirds supermajority needed to override that veto. Even within the Republican Party, the debate is fracturing along unexpected lines. Representatives Ro Khanna of California, a Democrat, and Thomas Massie of Kentucky, a Republican, have together introduced the bipartisan War Powers Resolution. But other members, including Republican Mike Lawler of New York and Democrat Josh Gottheimer of New Jersey, have opposed the measure, arguing in a joint statement that it would restrict the flexibility needed to respond to real and evolving threats, and risk signaling weakness at a dangerous moment. The midterm primary season has added another dimension to this political calculation. In North Carolina's 4th Congressional District, a Democratic primary election is underway Tuesday. Challenger Nida Allam released a campaign video Monday explicitly condemning the war and criticizing the incumbent for accepting money from defense contractors, a sign that the Iran war will immediately reshape the political landscape heading into midterms. The first battleground of 2026 politics is, in every sense of the phrase, a battlefield. The economic consequences of Operation Epic Fury are already rippling through global markets, and they are significant. The central variable is oil, and it sits at the intersection of this war: American consumer prices, global inflation, and the strategic interests of every major power on Earth. Iran is the world's 6th largest oil producer, pumping approximately 3.1 million barrels per day. But its strategic value goes beyond its own output. Tehran controls, or at minimum threatens, the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly 1/5 of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas supplies flow every single day. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard has reportedly begun restricting commercial shipping through the strait as of Monday. China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning confirmed in a press briefing on March 2nd that Beijing was deeply concerned about the Strait of Hormuz and its impact on global energy security, urging relevant parties to immediately stop military operations. According to CNN Business Reporting, energy analysts estimate that even a partial disruption of Iranian oil exports would cause crude prices to rise by at least $10 to $12 per barrel. A full blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, a scenario that has not yet materialized but remains a stated Iranian threat, would constitute the most severe energy supply shock in modern history. The knock-on effect for American consumers would be direct: higher gasoline prices, rising transportation costs, and renewed inflationary pressure at a moment when many American families are already stretched thin by years of economic turbulence. Emirates Airline, the world's largest long-haul carrier, had suspended all operations out of Dubai following the outbreak of hostilities, contributing to a wave of more than 11,000 flight cancellations across the region since Saturday. On Monday evening, limited operations resumed, a modest sign that the immediate operational disruption may ease, even as the strategic uncertainty deepens. From the perspective of the U.S. domestic economy, the financial implications of a prolonged conflict extend well beyond fuel prices. A war lasting 4 to 5 weeks, as Trump himself has suggested, carries costs measured in the tens of billions of dollars. Defense contractors may benefit in the short term, but a sustained conflict risks diverting fiscal resources, rattling investor confidence, and introducing inflationary pressures into an economy that was showing signs of stabilization. Critics in Congress have made exactly this argument, that an open-ended military campaign in the Middle East represents not just a foreign policy gamble, but a domestic economic risk that Americans will feel at the grocery store, the gas pump, and in their retirement accounts. To understand Russia's reaction to the Iran war, you first need to understand where U.S.-Russia relations stood just days before the strikes began. After years of hostility that reached a peak following Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, the Trump administration had been quietly but deliberately rebuilding diplomatic channels with Moscow. In February, the U.S. and Russia agreed to resume high-level military-to-military dialogue for the first time in more than 4 years. Secretary of State Marco Rubio had met with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, on February 18th in a 4.5-hour session that covered Ukraine peace negotiations and the restoration of diplomatic relations. Russia's special envoy Kirill Dmitriev described the subsequent dynamic as a fragile hope that dialogue has been restored. That fragile hope has now been tested by Operation Epic Fury. According to Wikipedia's Russia-United States relations entry, updated as of this week, relations deteriorated again between late February and early March 2026 after the United States and Israel launched a massive attack on Iran. Russia and China jointly requested an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council to address the Iran situation over the weekend. Russia's Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova was seen publicly addressing Russian nationals in Bahrain, a signal of Moscow's concern about Iranian retaliation reaching Russian citizens in the region. The Russian calculus here is layered and complex. On one hand, Iran has been a vital strategic partner for Russia, providing military drones and missiles that have been deployed in the war in Ukraine. Russia and Iran have cooperated on joint naval exercises in the Gulf of Oman, and Moscow has consistently rejected Western sanctions on Tehran. The death of Khamenei and the destabilization of the Iranian regime could, over time, weaken Russia's military supply chain. On the other hand, Russia has every incentive not to directly confront the United States at a moment when it is pursuing a peace settlement in Ukraine that heavily favors Moscow's territorial interests. A Russian international journalist and civic chamber member, Nikita Anisimov, captured the sentiment in commentary published Monday, the U.S. Attack on Iran, he wrote, opens a new page in international relations where the future world order is written in the blood of innocent victims. Russia's position for now appears to be one of diplomatic condemnation paired with strategic restraint, a posture designed to preserve the U.S.-Russia rapprochement while not abandoning its Iranian partner entirely. For the American economy, the Russia-Iran dynamic carries a specific financial risk. If Iran's capacity to supply drones and missiles to Russia is significantly degraded by U.S. strikes, Russia may be forced to seek alternative suppliers or accelerate its own domestic weapons production, potentially extending the Ukraine conflict and prolonging the associated economic pressures on European energy markets, which have cascading effects on U.S. trade relationships. Of all the global powers watching Operation Epic Fury unfold, none has more at stake and more reason to move carefully than China. And Beijing's response in these first 72 hours has been a masterclass in strategic ambiguity. China is Iran's most critical economic lifeline. According to CNBC reporting, China purchased more than 80% of Iran's oil exports in 2025, accounting for 13.5% of all crude China imported by sea. Any sustained disruption to Iranian oil production or a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz directly threatens Beijing's energy security. China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning said Monday that Beijing is deeply concerned and urged all parties to immediately stop military operations. Mao Ning confirmed that China and Russia had problems as Beijing restated Avadimol requested the emergency UN Security Council session, framing China's stance as one of international law and multilateral diplomacy rather than direct confrontation. Yet despite this diplomatic posture, Bloomberg reported Monday morning that Beijing has shown little support for Tehran's defense, besides criticizing the attacks. The reason, analysts say, is strategic prioritization. A Trump-Xi summit is weeks away, and China has enormous incentives, ongoing trade negotiations, tariff structures, and the Taiwan file to maintain stable relations with Washington. As Bloomberg's analysis notes, Xi's measured style can help stabilize the summit with Trump, and Beijing's restraint on Iran could be leveraged to keep U.S. tariffs low on Chinese goods and protect the supply of critical minerals from China to American factories. Ahmed Aboudo, a fellow at Chatham House in London, offered a striking assessment. A weakened Iran may paradoxically serve Chinese interests. The weaker the Iranian regime gets, Abudo told CNBC, whether from U.S. or Israeli military strikes or domestic unrest, the more diplomatically, economically, and technologically dependent on China it will become. In other words, the destruction of Tehran's current leadership structure could tighten Beijing's grip over whatever government emerges from the ashes. For the United States, the China calculation has direct economic implications. If Beijing decides to accelerate oil purchases from Russia to compensate for Iranian supply disruptions, as Bloomberg suggested Monday, this would further cement the China-Russia economic axis, complicate U.S. sanctions policy, and reduce the leverage Washington has over Moscow in Ukraine negotiations. The Iran war may, unintentionally, be drawing the two great powers that Washington most fears into closer alignment. The European Union's reaction to Operation Epic Fury has been measured in tone but unmistakable in its substance. Europe did not know this was coming. Europe was not consulted, and Europe is alarmed. EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs Kaja Kallas, speaking for all 27 EU member states, issued a formal statement on Sunday calling for maximum restraint and the protection of civilians, while invoking international law and the principles of the United Nations Charter. The Middle East stands to lose greatly from any drawn-out war, Kallas stated. The EU also explicitly condemned Iran's retaliatory attacks on regional countries, urging Tehran to refrain from indiscriminate military strikes, a careful effort to maintain a position of moral consistency on all sides of the conflict. But the diplomatic subtext here carries enormous weight. The Trump administration's decision to launch a major military campaign without consulting its European allies is not an isolated incident. It fits a broader pattern of transatlantic friction that has defined U.S.-EU relations since Trump's return to office. Europe has spent much of 2025 and early 2026 managing the fallout of being sidelined in Ukraine negotiations, facing renewed U.S. tariff threats, and watching Washington openly court Moscow. The Iran strikes add a new and potentially more dangerous layer to that estrangement. The EU's statement explicitly flagged the risk to global economic infrastructure. The disruption of critical waterways, like the Strait of Hormuz, must be avoided. This is not merely a rhetorical concern. European nations are heavily dependent on Middle Eastern energy. Any Strait of Hormuz disruption would spike energy costs across the continent, risking recession in economies that are still fragile from years of post-COVID inflation and the Ukraine-driven energy crisis. The UK, outside the EU but a close transatlantic partner, has partially evacuated both of its military bases in Cyprus, Akrotiri, and Dhekelia following Iranian strike threats, according to reports circulating Monday. This is a concrete indicator of just how broadly the operational risk of this conflict is being assessed by U.S. allies in the region. For the American economy, the strain on the EU relationship carries long-term costs. Europe remains the United States' largest trading partner bloc. A prolonged war that further damages transatlantic trust, disrupts European economic stability, and forces EU governments into an uncomfortable political position between Washington and their own publics, which are overwhelmingly opposed to another Middle East war, creates conditions for trade, friction, reduced investment cooperation, and diplomatic dissonance at a moment when great power competition demands Western unity. Here is what to watch in the hours and days ahead. In Washington, Congress will vote on war powers resolutions potentially as soon as this week. The outcome is unlikely to stop the military campaign, but it will define the constitutional precedent for executive war-making power for a generation. The political fault lines being drawn right now in the midterm primaries will determine who controls Congress in 2027 and whether any president can be checked on questions of war and peace. On the military front, President Trump has stated that the campaign was projected to last 4 to 5 weeks and that U.S. forces are already ahead of schedule. The key question is whether Iranian retaliation will expand geographically, whether Hezbollah in Lebanon escalates its attacks on Israel, whether Iranian proxies in Iraq and Syria intensify operations against U.S. forces, and critically, whether the Strait of Hormuz moves from a partial to a full blockade. The Iranian succession question is the most immediate strategic uncertainty. With Khamenei dead and reports unconfirmed regarding his successor, the Iranian decision-making structure is in a moment of maximum vulnerability and maximum unpredictability. Experts warn that a decapitated leadership may lash out harder, not because it has more strength, but because it has less to lose. Trump confirmed Monday that he has not yet contacted Iran's interim leadership, but indicated he intends to do so. On the economic front, oil markets will be the barometer. Watch crude oil prices, the movement of tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, and whether Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia, which suffered Iranian strikes on its capital and eastern oil infrastructure, can stabilize their output to offset any Iranian supply disruption. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank will likely be monitoring GDP revision models for the global economy within days. And on the geopolitical front, the Trump-Xi summit, expected in coming weeks, now takes on far greater significance. The conversation between Washington and Beijing about Iran, the Strait, trade, and Taiwan will be among the most consequential diplomatic engagements of the decade. Meanwhile, whether Russia uses the Iran crisis as leverage in Ukraine negotiations or allows it to quietly derail the diplomatic progress made in Riyadh will shape the European security order for years to come. 3 days ago, the Middle East looked one way. Today, it looks entirely different. Operation Epic Fury has changed the calculus not just for Iran, not just for the Middle East, but for the United States at home and its relationships with every major power on Earth. 4 American service members have given their lives. Hundreds of thousands of airline passengers have had their travel disrupted. Oil markets are trembling. Congress is in constitutional confrontation with the executive branch. China is calculating, Russia is watching, Europe is alarmed. The question that will define the weeks ahead is deceptively simple to ask and extraordinarily difficult to answer. What does the United States want to achieve, and at what cost is it willing to achieve it? That is the question that every senator, every investor, every ally, and every adversary is asking right now. And until Washington provides a clearer, more consistent answer, the world and the American economy will remain in a state of high-stakes uncertainty. Keep watching this space. The next 72 hours may be even more decisive than the last.